All right, let's dig into one of history's great unsolved mysteries. We're talking about the prophet Ezekiel, a man whose life was, let's be honest, a series of wild public spectacles. But when it comes to how he died, the official record just goes completely silent. So, how on earth did his story actually end?
I mean, seriously, this is the guy who saw the very throne chariot of God, a vision so mind-blowing it became the basis for centuries of mystical thought. You'd think a life like that would have a finale to match, right? Well, the truth is way, way stranger.
And just so we're all on the same page, let's remember who we're dealing with. This was not your everyday prophet. He did some of the most bizarre, physically demanding things in the entire Bible. He lay on his side for over a year. He baked bread over animal dung to make a point about a siege. He saw a vision of a valley of dry bones rattling back to life. He even lost his wife, the delight of his eyes, and was told by God not to even cry. After all of that, you get to the end of his book, and nothing. It just stops.
So, our first stop has to be the main source, right? The book of Ezekiel itself. What clues, if any, does the actual text give us about what happened to him?
This timeline really lays out the whole problem perfectly. We can actually track his career with some pretty amazing precision. He gets his call from God in 593 BC, when he's about 30. We have dated prophecies from him for the next 22 years. His final, dated vision comes in 571 BC, which would make him about 52 years old. And after that, just a giant question mark. The record just stops, cold.
You see, instead of getting some kind of epilogue, here's what happened to our guy Ezekiel. The book ends with these 9 super long chapters of the most detailed architectural blueprints you can possibly imagine for a new, perfect temple. It's all about gates and chambers and cubits. It's a vision for the future of a people, not the biography of a person.
After the last measurement is given, the scroll just ends. The story of this incredible, larger-than-life prophet is just left hanging. For us today, we love closure. We want to know how the story ends, and this is just so unsatisfying.
Well, you know how it is. People can't just leave a mystery like this alone. If the official record has a big empty space, you can bet that tradition is going to find a way to fill it. And that is exactly what happened here, as later stories tried to write the ending that the Bible didn't.
So this is the story that started to make the rounds, and it became really popular. It's dramatic, it's heroic, it gives Ezekiel this epic martyr's death. The legend says he was executed by the leader of his own people, the Israelite exiles in Babylon, because he had the guts to call them out for worshiping idols. It's a really compelling ending, and it totally fits the profile of a fiery, confrontational prophet. But where did the story come from?
So the source for this is an ancient book called The Lives of the Prophets. It's basically a collection of short biographies about the biblical prophets, probably written sometime around the 1st century. And it is jam-packed with these kinds of dramatic, often violent death scenes. But that brings up the big question, right? Is it actual history?
Okay, so let's put on our historian hats for a minute, because this is where we really have to be careful and separate what's in the biblical canon from what comes from later traditions.
You see, the lives of the prophets is what we call apocrypha, and that's a really important word here. It just means these are ancient writings that, for whatever reason, weren't accepted as divinely inspired or historically reliable enough to make it into the official Jewish or Christian scriptures. They're historically interesting for sure, but they're not considered authoritative in the same way.
So when you put them side by side, you see this huge difference in what they're trying to do. The biblical record is laser-focused on one thing: God's message coming through Ezekiel. His personal story only matters when it serves that message. But these later traditions, they shift the spotlight entirely onto Ezekiel himself, giving the messenger a heroic sign-off. They're just two fundamentally different projects.
Which, of course, brings up a really fascinating question. If these stories probably aren't historical, then why did someone write them in the first place? What was the point?
Well, a lot of scholars have a pretty compelling theory about this. If you look in the New Testament, you see passages where Jesus and Stephen say that Israel had a nasty habit of killing the prophets that God sent to them. But here's the thing. If you go back and read the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, very few prophets are actually recorded as being killed. So the theory goes that texts like Lives of the Prophets were maybe written to fill in those gaps, to provide the backstories that would line up with those later claims.
And all of this brings us to what I think is the real answer, and it kind of reframes the entire question. What if the Bible's silence isn't an accident or a missing piece? What if not knowing is the whole point?
So here's the key thing we have to realize. Today, we expect a biography to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But the original audience, those Jewish exiles in Babylon who actually knew Ezekiel, they wouldn't have even expected his death to be recorded in that scroll. It just wasn't what the document was for.
And this makes total sense when you think about it. These ancient prophetic books weren't meant to be biographies. They were archives of God's word. The whole point of the scroll was to preserve the message, not the man. I mean, think about it. The books of Isaiah and Jeremiah, two other absolute giants of prophecy, they also don't record how they died, because the focus was never supposed to be on them.
I mean, it's right there in his name. In Hebrew, his name, Yexakel, means God strengthens or God will strengthen. His whole identity was about being a channel, someone made strong by God in order to deliver a message. He wasn't the source of the power, he was the one being empowered for a specific job.
And that right there is the real answer to our mystery. The reason we don't get a death scene is because Ezekiel's death was, frankly, beside the point. His entire life, all the weird things he did, his personal tragedies, his incredible visions, it was all designed to point away from himself and toward God's message of judgment and ultimately of hope.
So in the end, it all boils down to this simple, powerful idea. The message outlives the messenger. It always has, it always will. The scroll of Ezekiel is still being read thousands of years later, not because we have some dramatic story about how he died, but because of the divine word he delivered. His personal story had to end so that the divine story could keep going. Which kind of leaves us with one last thought to chew on. We are so obsessed with endings, with getting that perfect sense of closure. But the mystery of Ezekiel's death kind of forces us to ask a totally different question. What's really more important? How a story ends, or the reason why it was told in the first place?